Started. New people, y'all may not realize that I don't let anybody steal my Bible class time. Daniel's an exception. He'll go 3 or 4 minutes before he ever starts, but I have a lot of material I want to cover, and we need to kind of stay on schedule, especially this time. You'll see in a moment that this quarter, there's one less Sunday than normal. There's only 12 this quarter, I guess because of February, but anyway, so that just means I got to preach once at the very end here to get it all in. And those who are new also, this is the beginning of a quarter, and we do that because mainly just to have a summer quarter, kind of line up with the school summer. So we start December, January, February, and then our spring quarter is March, April, May, then we go into our summer. So that's why we start here now. So we'll begin with our memory verse. And I have to read this because my version, I read from the New King James Version. There is a number of different words that the New King James Version uses, like, hold fast to what is good. Mine says cling to what is good. There's a number of different ones. So to kind of follow along and not confuse everybody, especially my wife when she's sitting next to me, I'll usually read most of this. So let's read this together. Let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection, outdo one another in showing honor. All right, so we are engaged. We're going to begin a study in the book of Ecclesiastes. Y'all may remember, at least some of you, I taught this class during pandemic, and I taught it online when we weren't meeting at the building. And I'm really excited to do this now here with all of us here together. I think it'll be much better in doing that. So hopefully you have one of these workbooks. If not, we're going to have to make some more because I see we're out. I don't know if Daniel's planning on. Does anybody still need one? So we still got 2 or 3. So can we make a few more of these? We still got 2 or 3 people that don't have one.
Still talk to me after class, or send me an email. I'll make sure we get more printed.
And basically, this just has our outline in it, as well as just your questions for every week. So you have them all up front. You know what to do. You don't have to wait on an email from me or anything. So, all right, I want to begin class this morning by looking at this. Does anybody know who this is? It's fairly recent development. It's happened. So her name is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and she was raised in Somalia, raised under the very strict Muslim Sharia law, a very harsh atmosphere, or a harsh culture to grow up in. And like many of her contemporaries, as they grew up, they sought escape from this harsh rule by going into atheism. And y'all may have heard the name Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell wrote a book called Why I Am Not a Christian. And it was kind of their textbook that many Muslims that grew up and her contemporaries grew up and used to get away from this Muslim upbringing. And they just go into atheism, and they used him as just kind of the truth, of the matter. Just recently, and when I say recently, I mean last month, in November of 2023, she came out and publicly announced her conversion to Christianity. And she published a book, which came out last month. I have not read it, so I can't recommend it to you. But it's Why I Am Now a Christian. So obviously a play off Bertrand Russell's book. And I want to read something that she says. And you may be wondering, what in the world does this have to do with Ecclesiastes? So, something she said in her book is going to lead us into our study of Ecclesiastes. She said this. She said, I would not be truthful if I attributed my embrace of Christianity solely to the realization that atheism is too weak and divisive a doctrine to fortify us against our menacing foes. I have also, she said, turned to Christianity because I ultimately found life without any spiritual solace unendurable. Indeed, very near self-destructive. In short, atheism failed to answer one simple question. What is the meaning and purpose of life? And that is exactly why we're studying the book of Ecclesiastes. That, I believe, is why the Holy Spirit has given us the book of Ecclesiastes to answer that very question. And most of my information I've gathered from a number of commentaries, but most predominantly from a book written by Paul Earnhardt called Searching for the Meaning of Life. Because that's what it seems the preacher in Ecclesiastes is doing. And so this is our syllabus that we're going to have. I'll go through this each week. December 3rd, introduction here. And I want to note something here because I'm going to come back to it pretty soon. I want you to notice that all the different topics, there's really no continuity to any of it. I mean, it's just all different things. Wisdom, pleasures and palaces, God's righteous rule, God amidst the shadows. I mean, it just seems like just new topics every single week. And I'm going to make a point about that in just a moment. But in your workbook, if you had a chance to do that, I asked you to read through the book of Ecclesiastes. And I mean, just read it. Takes you a few minutes. And I want to ask you, so from your perspective, what is the purpose of the book of Ecclesiastes? How do you interpret it? I know I just mentioned, that the preacher's searching for the meaning of life, but maybe you got more out of it than that. So I'll open the floor to any comments there. I'll pause for a second. John and then Judy.
In looking over these options, or thinking about another option, to me, C and D, thinker caught in the tensions of life, contemplating opposite realities, and then defending a life of faith in a generous God. I mean, we have the benefit of knowing a little bit more about the author than just this book in isolation. We know that he was given great wisdom, and we know he had some failings later in life. But to me, when you put those two together, that kind of helps define what he's trying to do.
If, in fact, we attribute this to Solomon, which I do, and I think many do, though he doesn't specifically say that, right? But it's pretty clear, son of David, king in Jerusalem. There's not many that can claim that besides Solomon. But so very good. Anybody else? In addition to that, Judy?
To me, it was a book of warnings pointing out that what man desires and seeks after has no eternal value when you're faced with death and what comes after, and you have no control over any of it. Yeah. And then he also urged to turn to God in everything in your life. It seemed like he spent more time on the negatives other than that. Yeah. As far as how many he mentioned things.
Okay, yeah. And that leads me to ask this question. It's kind of a little later in my notes, but it's real close. So how many of you found the book to be somewhat dark and cynical? I mean, I'm seeing some yes shaking heads. I mean, and it can come across that way, right? And I think, let me mention that. So I see the purpose. The preacher here is reflecting upon his own life, his own efforts to find ultimate meaning and purpose amidst all the perplexities of life, and to warn those who, and I think where Judy's coming from, warn those who come after him, especially the young, that nothing under the sun will ever fulfill the eternal longing which God put in the heart of man. The original word for vanity means breath or fleeting vapor. The word is used in Zechariah. I actually should have moved over here. In Zechariah chapter 10 and verse 2, which I think it gives us our best understanding of its use in Ecclesiastes, where he says, "For the idols speak delusions, the diviners envision lies and tell false dreams. They comfort in vain." That word vain being our word we're looking at. Zechariah says the idol's comfort is fleeting, it's empty. And that's what Solomon is saying, that the world is empty of giving us meaning and purpose under the sun. The world is. And though the author calls himself the preacher, it is clear that he views his counsel as words of truth given by one shepherd, not just good counsel. At the end of the book, he says this: the preacher sought to find acceptable words, and what was written was upright, words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and the words of scholars are like well-driven nails, given by one shepherd. And if indeed Solomon is the preacher here, the language clearly points to the fact that he is speaking in the realm of a teacher and not a king. He's trying to teach and warn. And so we talked about a minute ago that in a reading of this book, sometimes we find it cynical and dark, and I think that's because we don't remember that he is speaking, and I think we need to remember this as we go through the study, that he's speaking of life as viewed from beneath the sun. And viewed from that perspective, it is dark and cynical. When we understand that his words from this vantage point, I think the observations that he makes are valid in a world that gives no clue as to life's purpose. The world doesn't give us any answers to man's longing, doesn't give us any resolution to life's contradictions. I mean, jarring contradictions sometimes, and inequities. And the message to us here is that man, by his unaided wisdom, will never penetrate the mysteries that guard the purposes of God. How many of you, and I'm going to say this, I'm not going to get into this too much because I want to save it for a little devotion one time. How many of you have a problem with Job? I have an issue sometimes, or I did have. I kind of worked my way through and understand it, I think, now. But, Job and suffering, all of these things, especially when we think about in one fell swoop loses all 10 of his children that the book says he loved very much. And yet at the end, he's got 10 more, and everything's great. But what about the 10 I lost? I for a long time, I'm just like, I couldn't grasp that. And I think the message of Ecclesiastes helps me do that. And I'll save that for a devotion. I'll probably have one near the end of the month here. I got to do on a Wednesday night or something, and I'm gonna talk about that. But I don't know if any of the rest of you have grappled with that thought, but it's been something that went on in my mind for years. But I think there is an answer to it. So notice Paul's word. How many ever hundreds of years later, when he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 21, "For since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe." Now, the foolishness, he's using that accommodatively. It's foolish in the eyes of the world, not in our eyes, not in the eyes of those who believe it. But the world thinks it's foolishness, and it pleased God to save those who believe it. I'm talking under the context we talk about that those who tried their unaided wisdom to penetrate the mysteries, the purposes of God, they'll never do it unless they believe in the Word of God. Romans 1:21, where he says, "But became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened." Paul makes the point in these passages that God, in his wisdom, has determined that man, by his own wisdom, would never know him. That is his intent. Ecclesiastes is just making these same points, just in a more dramatic and practical way. So I'll pause there for a moment, open the floor for any comments. Anybody have any thoughts? Jim's not here, so he would have his hand up.
As I read through the book of Ecclesiastes, even things that we would think are good in themselves, if that becomes our focus in life, it's pure vanity.
I think that's a big point he makes throughout the book, yeah. the things that we see as like good and, oh, I'm going to pursue this, it's going to be great, it's going to be vanity in the end. But yeah, Michael.
You know, I've always thought that, similar to what you said, viewed under the sun, it does have kind of a darker tint to it. And I think it only has a darker tint to it if we're looking through the lens of the world. It has a darker tint to it.
Mm-hmm.
Because what it's saying is everything that you're doing is futile.
Yeah.
That's the purpose of it. And then you start reading, it's wisdom literature. It's supposed to be thought on and meditated on. It's supposed to try and convict you, and you're supposed to wrestle.
Yeah.
And everything that you see, on one hand, one verse I've always liked is whatever your hand finds to do it with all of your might.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, before that, he's going to say, hey, rest is actually better than labor.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do you mirror these two things? Well, I think that's what you're supposed to.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I think before the end of class today, I think I get into that a little bit too. There are some blessings about this world if we are a believer and we find our purpose in life in God. There are things about this world that that are blessings from God that we can enjoy. So I think that's a great point. Yeah. Just say hand. Yeah. Go ahead, Shelby.
It's interesting to me because I feel like he focuses a lot on the selfishness of man and how self-serving we are.
Mm-hmm.
And to say that we aren't supposed to be alone, it's better to have someone, and we were never meant to be alone and to serve ourselves. And it just, kind of takes you back to Genesis in the beginning where God's like, it's not good for us to be alone, and he tries to fix that. And we weren't meant to serve ourselves in the beginning. We were none of this life is meant for that. But it's like this never-ending circle of just people trying to serve themselves and ending up lonely and sad.
Right.
And it's like, if we would just look at the beginning of how it was supposed to be, then it wouldn't be this nothing new under the sun.
And this may be something that kind of Michael was referring to, but many people in pursuing that, they'll get to a point in life, it's like, what is the use? They'll realize the purposelessness of it. And that's when they find God. That right? So, and I think we have to get there at some point to do that. Yeah, John. And Ruth, did you have your hand up before John? You go ahead. John's already spoken with.
I thought it was interesting in reading this, chapter 1, verse 13, when it said, "And I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under the sun." And if Solomon wrote this, who gave him that wisdom?
Yeah, God did.
Exactly. So, the conclusion that he comes to is that all things are vanity under the sun.
Yeah.
And then, of course, at the end, when he gives us the conclusion, then we see, to me, that's what gives me, it boosts my faith to know that, because if I fear God and keep his commandments, this is man's all. That is what I have to look forward to and what I work for, as opposed to what's vanity here with just living life without God.
Yeah, he used that wisdom in an improper way, right? Seeking the pleasures and purpose of life. One example I like to give that everybody agrees would have been an improper use of the wisdom is to find it in the solace of women, and multiplying wives and women. And that's actually what led him astray. But yeah, very good point, John.
Yeah. Back to your points from 1 Corinthians and Romans, so much of what he writes about is what's going on between the ears. It's in our minds, it's how we think about things, it's what we believe about things. Not so much when you look around the world and see people trying to satisfy themselves with physical things, tangible things, when in fact, a lot of this, if not all of this, is what's going on in our minds.
Right. Good point. Yeah, Jamie.
Something that, and it kind of hit me, I guess, during COVID, it never really stuck out before, is I actually find comfort when in chapter 1 he talks about that there's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah.
And during COVID, we were sharing about, however, many years ago, there was another COVID type instance And I was
Yeah.
like, whoa, I didn't know, right? And it actually provided comfort that in the Bible, in the Word, it reminds us there's nothing.
Yeah, a good point, Yeah, Judy, and then we're gonna move on in the comments, so.
He mentions multiple times about not knowing the future and what's going to happen to your stuff when you die, all the things that you have for, and
Yeah,
just the transitory nature.
that's a good point. So I think we're gonna see multiple times throughout the book. One of the big, if not the biggest problem with finding purpose under the sun is the brevity of life, right? That's a big problem. So let me just stop for a minute. I know it's been a while since we studied Romans. I mentioned Romans in this text, but I think Romans has a striking contrast to the book of Ecclesiastes. Anybody, any thoughts on what that would be? It's very similar in a sense, especially as it starts out. It seems to be kind of dark. I mean, because what's the point of the first few chapters of Romans are what? Just to convict everyone under sin, right? So what's the difference, though, between Ecclesiastes and Romans?
Hope is arrived.
Okay, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the gospel of grace, is not in the book of Ecclesiastes, right? It is in Romans. So that's a good point. However, here's the point I want to make, and the reason I bring that point up. The preacher in Ecclesiastes does anticipate one. He does, in a sense, call for it in the book of Ecclesiastes, right?
I think he tries to push us towards finding him.
Well, not in Ecclesiastes, because it's not there to find. You see what I'm saying? Romans is doing that for sure. But in Ecclesiastes, it's just like, where do we go? You know, we need this, and he's pushing everybody maybe to desire it and want it, but it's not there at that point. When considered from the proper perspective, I think the book seems fairly clear, but you probably noticed, and this is where we go back to my agenda, our outline of classes we're going to have. The book doesn't really yield an obvious, clear-cut outline, and I think that's intentional. It seems to just spiral freely, repeatedly, through the same themes. If you read through the whole thing, you probably noticed that. He already said this like 3 times, you know. And the same themes of the world's bewildering contradictions and frustrations. Why do you think that? I think there's a purpose for him doing that. Yeah, no?
Well, it's like 1 John, it's the thought of how the Jewish thinking does.
Okay.
They what?
Circular logic.
Yeah, they're circular logic.
Okay.
That's a technical.
I'm going to say something about that for sure. And the Greeks too. But right now, it's not what I was looking for, but that is a good point. Go ahead. Anybody else? Thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
So the word in ESV is vanity, but I think it's that word pebble, which is what you were talking about earlier, like that vapor stone. That's like repeated like 38 times throughout the
Is that
book.
right? Yeah.
And so he's like, it seems like he's trying to find, it's just like this circular thing, like I'm trying to figure out what the reason of life is.
Okay.
Like, what's my purpose for life? And I feel like 9 through 13 is almost like a postscript by somebody else. Like, what is the purpose? Oh, it's to fear God and keep his commandments.
Yeah.
And his judgment is the hope. Because if you've done good,
Yeah.
good things come. If you've done evil, you're not.
So I think that's a good lead in. That's in a sense the same thing that I'm going to say, in that that's really, he's writing the book that way because that's really how life is. I mean, it's just that cyclical, that's how life is, so that's how he writes his book, you know. I mean, it's in a sense, it's structured the same way life is structured, you know, in a sense. Go ahead, Dan.
You know, when you were talking about that, I thought of the passage that talks about how we're like waves of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. You know, the scriptures often talk about the one who's not grounded in wisdom as having this certain chaos and randomness to life, and I think that tone is certainly shown through the way that he writes.
Very good. Yeah, that's right.
George,
Yeah, go ahead, Jake.
related to that, you know, I think individuals deal with that repetition through their own life, but I think the generations deal with it.
Yeah.
So I think kind of repeating the same things, it kind of indicates to the nation, to God's followers, not only is you and your generation going to do this,
Yeah.
But every single generation before and after, there's nothing new under the sun. And it kind of ingrains this pointing to, the end, kind of like we were talking about.
I'm actually going to bring that up next. That's a very, very good segue. First, I want to say this, though. Jessica mentioned at the end of the book, it says, fear God, and that's his final conclusion. That's what life's purpose is. But he's going to hint at that all through the book. He repeatedly is going to express confidence that the God who sits above the sun will bring an ultimate resolution. Can I suggest to you, well, I mentioned that already. There are two lessons that we need to take away from this book. And the first one is the critical importance of seeking ultimate meaning and fulfillment in the Creator rather than the creature. Is that not what our world seems to be just adamantly pushing towards now? The creature. That's where it's at. It's gone crazy to me in my mind. God meets us in this book in three ways. And I got this from Derek Kidner from his book. I thought it was great. He meets us in three ways in this book. First, as creator, and as sovereign, and as unsearchable. And then the second thing we want to learn from this is that once having planted our feet firmly in eternity, to find joy in the gifts of God, which, however temporary they are, I think this is what Michael is making the point about, they do bless us in this world beneath us, once we've planted our feet firmly in eternity. And so that's where we are. I want to read the first 8 verses of Ecclesiastes and then go on to comment. I will get to the part, Jake, that you mentioned. That's a really good point in a moment. So let's read verses 1 through 8. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit has a man from all of his labor in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it arose. The wind goes towards the south and turns around to the north. The wind whirls about continually and comes again on its circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the river comes, there they return again. All things are full of labor. Man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. So he begins the book with this very lean brevity, the words of the preacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, when he says the words, he really means a whole lot more than just what the preacher has to say. This short saying was a well-known Jewish Old Testament expression. You would see it in Proverbs 30 and chapter 31 in verse 1 of each one of those Proverbs, in Amos chapter 1 and verse 1. And it bears a remarkable similarity to the introduction to Jeremiah as well. As you'll know, Amos and Jeremiah have a pretty dark prophecy to make as well. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah of the priests who were in Anathoth. Now he immediately moves to the thesis that brackets this entire book, vanity of vanities. We see that in verse 2. We're going to see it again in chapter 12 and verse 8. Which suggests basically everything in between is vanity of vanities. And then he proceeds to identify where the pointlessness of life lies. What profit does a man have from all of his labor in which he toils under the sun? And then he begins to demonstrate his points with actual examples that many of us have experienced in life as well. And this gets back over to, I think this is where I get into Jake's point there. So a very poetic picture, in a sense, where living in the world is described as wearisome, pointless, due to its brevity. One commentator described it as a monotonous prison. The earth on which life is played out seems to last forever, doesn't it? Just goes on and on and on, while we, the actors, constantly come and go. Furthermore, he says, even if we could abide like the earth, life under the sun never gets you anywhere because the earth itself moves endlessly in constantly repeated cycles of sun and wind and sea. It's almost like he's describing a hamster, in his wheel, just running as much as he can. He's going nowhere. Motion without direction. And the original language here paints a picture of a runner just endlessly running around a track, in a sense. In reference to the sea, the point is not cyclical monotony, but like the sun and the wind, as he points out, but just futile activity. All of these things are intended to impress upon the reader a very profound sensation about life, one that we can really relate to. It was interesting that this was exactly the Greeks' view of history. I think Noel mentioned the Jews also had somewhat of a similar view of history, but that human events keep cycling in perpetual repetition. These same events, history repeats itself, in other words, traveling in these endless circles like a man lost in a snowstorm, becomes, as one commentator noted it, a tale of an idiot signifying nothing. Now remember, the preacher's point here, so is life without God. It goes nowhere. It reveals no purpose or point. No wonder it's laborious. So allow me now, though, to make a point from Scripture. Psalm 19:1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God." And Romans 1:20, we looked at a moment ago, says that the creation revealed God's power and deity, but they only reveal these things to those who believe it. I look at creation, and for a long time I didn't understand, even as a Christian, how can I understand? I can understand God looking at creation, but how do I understand the Godhead? How do I understand He's higher than I am? Scott may have a point. He's going back to something different.
But there's a book out there, I think Frank Turek, but and the title of the book is "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist."
Yeah,
Because it's so
that's kind of what
obvious
she.
there's a God.
That's kind of what she was saying at the very beginning. You know what I mean? It said it was weak.
Yep.
But yeah, good point. But the reason I understand that there is a Godhead is because, I can't create. Especially when you look at the beauty of God. I can't create that. I don't have the power to create that. Well, somebody did have the power to create it. And if I don't have the power to, and He does, I'm subject to Him. He's more powerful than I am. And therefore, there is a Godhead. There is an order of things like that. I believe that, no man has the power to create the world. And so believe there must be something greater than I that did. But to look at these things and to try and understand it without that belief, it's just futile. Like Scott just said, that requires a lot more faith. Because, where are you going to get the basis for that faith? Scott?
Just one other thing, something I've played with, but I've said there isn't a scientist in the world that believes in evolution. Because if they're a scientist, they wouldn't believe in evolution.
Yeah, well, there's
no science for it.
Yeah, right. There isn't any. And so without that belief, we just wander hopelessly the earth in search of who we are, where we're going. And it's the Bible that gives the world a view of history that's linear, that's purposeful, moving to a consummation. Solomon's sense of vanity is not merely emptiness or futility. It's not just empty and futile. It is vanity of vanities, futility of the profoundest sort, and emptiness that reaches to the essence of life. In fact, some have suggested that the force of that text in verse 8 is that no one can adequately say how wearisome the world really is. And when he says no one is able to speak. nor the ear filled with hearing. Man cannot express it, my version says. It's all the more significant when you consider that the wise are expected to know the explanation of things and are able to control their tongues. What they say is important and should be heeded. The fool, on the other hand, babbles on before God, saying nothing. Neither one of these can speak to or about the world to explain, influence, or control it without God. Any thoughts? I want to read the next passage, a few verses, but John?
You know, if you try to think of the greatest human that ever lived, aside from Jesus Christ, and to put it in perspective, they're all gone.
Yeah.
All of the great ones from history, the great builders, the great leaders, they're all gone.
Yep.
And a lot of their work is gone. And we're living, you know, in this little brief slice of time. And just like every other person, you know, we think everything is like it has been since we've been alive, even if we're a student of history. But compared to God and what He has done and continues to do, you know, man is such limited and minuscule compared to God.
I want to make a point of what you're saying there, that, you know, all these men are dead. You know, these influential people are dead. And we have this little bitty slice of time that we are here. Would it not make sense, to me, make sense, that we would immerse ourselves and commit ourselves to the one that still lives? The only one that still lives. To me, that just would go without saying, but let's look at verse 9 through 11. That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. And there's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. And this really is the conclusion to the prologue of the book. And though it doesn't seem cynical, it does seem to be filled with despair. He seems to be reiterating that looking at the world from beneath the sun, human effort, human wisdom, struggle to make sense of things apart from God. We're so accustomed to placing the template of God's Word over the face of creation that we can easily lose the true sense of meaninglessness that life under the sun can seem to reflect. And we need to keep reminding ourselves that although God has not left Himself without some witness in the material universe, and the New Testament preachers, and Paul and Peter, they make that point. Acts 14, Acts 17, Romans 1:20 that we just read. It still appears by mere observation to be exactly what Solomon says it is, doesn't it? Even today, an endless cycle of unchanging patterns, insolvable problems. Even the gospel, which brings true purpose and hope into the world beneath the sun, doesn't reveal everything. It still leaves us with mysteries to deal with. Who wrote the book of Hebrews? I mean, that's one of the easy ones, but it still leaves us with that. The book of Job, you know, that truth. When God finally speaks to him, when he's looking for answers to this, and God finally speaks to him, He asks him a number of questions afterwards, and Job stops. But did God answer any of his questions? Not a one. Basically, all those questions were designed to say, know who I am and trust me. I know what I'm doing. From the vantage point of the technology age that we live in today, this is the point I was going to make from Jay's deal. I'm afraid we tend to challenge this idea a little bit. Isaiah 40 verse 26, he even says this, lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these things, who brings out their host by number. He calls them all by name, by the greatness of His might and the strength of His power. Not one is missing. Talking about the stars of heaven, I think, and maybe the planets, etc. Was Solomon able to fly? We can. I mean, did any of their contemporaries set foot on the moon? Did they understand nuclear physics? But are we really asking the right question when we ask that? Even with all the experience and knowledge that we have today, it still doesn't change anything that Solomon is asking us to consider. Has the rotation of the earth or the cycles of nature been altered? No, not by any of our technologies. Have the heavens been changed? Have the stars fallen from the sky? Do we not look at the same constellations, moving in the same courses that the ancient Israelites did? In the final analysis of our scientific and our technological advances, it has changed nothing. None of these things. It has been left as the Creator made it. And not only that, the basic problem of humanity has not changed either. Like the very first man, we still struggle with the same issues of life that they did. And we always will here under the sun. Man seeks closure, if you will, from these endless cyclings of the universe and this desire to reflect in man's daily affairs. We have filled history with every labor imaginable, and in doing so have altered nothing. It is this very theme that the preacher is still pressing when this book ends. Of making of many books, there is no end, and much study is wearisome to the flesh. I'm going to read. I want to go over and read 2 Peter chapter 3, and then we'll stop there and consider next week how this fits into Ecclesiastes, because I think it does well. 2 Peter 3, verse 3 through 7. Knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? Notice what he says here. From since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. That sounds just like the Ecclesiastes writer, doesn't it? For this they willfully forget, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and the perdition of ungodly men. How does this fit into Ecclesiastes, or does it? And we'll take up that question next week. Any final comments, thoughts before we close? Yeah, Jake.
I've been reflecting, you've been speaking about Philippians 4, specifically 11 and 12, where Paul discusses, in every situation I've learned how to abound, in every situation I've learned how to be content, and it's through Christ that strengthens me. And that seems a fitting example of somebody that has considered Ecclesiastes, has internalized that I can get through everything. That's what my true blessing is.
I like to associate that verse with Titus 2:11. The grace of God teaches us, and it taught him too. So appreciate those comments. Thanks. Appreciate everyone's participation this morning.